Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming out to tonight's talk. We've got a pretty cool presentation for you guys about technical art by Steve Zapata. So really quick, just before we dive into that, I wanted to announce a couple of events that we have coming up shortly. SGDA is collaborating with the Sound Club on campus to host 3 events in a sound mini-series for you guys. So first up, next week on October 14th, we have a talk about sound design for AAA games. We've got a dev from Bungie coming in to talk about that. The week after that, on Tuesday, October 20th, we are having part 1 of a sound workshop series. The Sound Club will be leading part 1 on their Discord server, talking about sound asset creation. And then the following night, on Wednesday, October 21st, SGDA is hosting part 2 of that workshop, led by JC Steed, who is the president of the Sound Club. And he'll be on the SGDA server to talk about sound design and implementation in Unity. So essentially, once you have your sound assets, how are you going to bring them into Unity for a complete game? So if you're interested in learning about sound and coming out to those events, we look forward to having you guys. But with that said, I will kind of turn it over to Steve and we can get into the talk.
Cool. All right. Howdy. So I'm Steve. Thanks for inviting me to give the talk. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I was a student at UT Dallas, graduated in 2015 from the ATech program. I even have my little graduate mug. So can I just dive right in, or are we sort of good to go? Sweet. Okay. So I'm Steve, like I said, and I'm a technical artist. So I think the initial title for this was a career in tech art or something, and that is a huge question. Huge because tech art is this really poorly and super broad, like poorly defined and really broad term. So I kind of figured that I would try to narrow the scope a little bit and talk about tech art from my perspective and sort of through my own experiences through my career, basically. So my talk is called The Anatomy of Stylized Rendering, and yeah, I'm gonna just dive right in. So first off, just a little bit about me and some of my background. So right now I'm a technical artist at Niantic. I work on Pokemon Go, as well as I do a fair amount of prototyping for internal projects and features for Pokemon Go and some other stuff. I also do a lot of side projects and side explorations sort of in my free time. Little projects with friends, game jams, that sort of stuff. Before that, I was a 3D lead, tech art, and co-founder of a small indie company called Polynight Games. I think 2 weeks ago, or maybe it was a month ago, y'all might have heard Tyler Tomaseski give a presentation. He and I and a few other students from UTD back in about 2015 all co-founded that company together. And together we developed, ported, and released a game called Interspace. And we published that on like PC, Mac, Linux, Xbox, kind of everything under the sun, Nintendo Switch, etc. Beyond that, I've also had my work featured in publications like Edge Magazine, IGN, Eurogamer, Kotaku, PlayStation Blog, PC Gamer, etc., etc., etc. And then I've had work featured in the Indiecade selection in 2017. So that was Interspace. They asked us to come and show our game. And yeah, like I said at the top of the talk, I graduated in 2015 from UT Dallas with a BA in Arts and Technology. So it's good to be talking with y'all again. And I'm sort of curious as we get into the Q&A session, to hear from y'all how things have changed and sort of what y'all's experiences are, especially since it's been 5 years since since I was there. So yeah. So I'm going to skip past. Oh, what's up? Oh yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm gonna skip past showing my work and stuff. Like y'all can look it up if you want to. And instead, I'm gonna try to do a little experiment. So we're gonna see how this works. I know we're sort of on chat and stuff, and this isn't live necessarily. But yeah, can I sort of just throw a question out there and see how many responses we get? Who are all of you? What are y'all's focuses? What are y'all interested in doing as ATech students or CS students or something other students? Yeah, can I sort of try to get a comp for the room really quick? And let me pop over to the chat here and see if anything comes in. So how long do y'all think I should wait for this? Okay, I'll just time it with my watch. Hold on. Okay, so this is streaming on Twitch, yeah? Okay, so questions are coming in through Twitch? Okay, that's why.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, we've got a couple answers rolling in. We've got some people interested in design, visual effects. We've got a couple CS majors in here.
Okay.
Interested in general games programming, software development, AI, and VR.
Okay.
So yeah.
Cool. Gotcha. So I want to make this pretty conversational. So Cam, please feel free to interrupt me sort of as we're going through if there are questions in the chat. And chat, if y'all have questions, just throw them out there, and I'll try to sort of get to them as best I can. Yeah.
Yeah,
All right,
absolutely.
cool.
I can help mediate.
Cool. I appreciate it. So sort of a broad overview of the sort of 4 main things that I want to sort of touch on with this presentation. So first thing, I want to sort of talk sort of briefly about sort of this historic precedent for stylized rendering, as demonstrated with the Impressionism movement, and I want to sort of draw some parallels between that and the sort of current indie games space. I also want to sort of re-examine the way we think about style and reframe it as a series of rules, and I'll explain that later. But effectively, rules can be sort of codified, and this is a sort of way that we can examine the problem of stylized rendering and try to figure out how to, quote unquote, solve it. And then third, if there's time, I figured I could actually do like a little live demo and sort of do a technical breakdown on a example project that I have to really sort of deep dive and get into the weeds on some of the stylized rendering. It's not meant to be a tutorial. It's mostly just sort of a big overview to sort of show possibilities and get some excitement and drive some curiosity in the space. And then last, I've got a bunch of resource links in this presentation. So feel free to pull it open later for reference. I think there's some really valuable stuff there if this is the kind of work that interests you. So I want to start out by just asking, what is style? So how do we think about it? How do we create it or recreate it? And how do we do that in 3D? As a tech artist, this is something that I am particularly interested in. So on the left here, we've got a painting from the 1800s. And on the right, we have another painting from the 1800s. But these are very clearly different on a stylistic basis, right? So what happened? What is the difference? Let's talk about this for a second. So on the left, you have a sort of realism painting where the focus is on capturing in detail and accurately the subjects, the lighting, the perspective, and all of that stuff, right? So it's very, well, it's focused on realism. And on the right, from a painter you may have heard of, named Van Gogh, is an Impressionist piece. And very clearly, this piece is not interested in super highly accurate detail, right? So instead, Impressionism broadly sort of emerged as a sort of counter to the sort of realism space, stylistic space, right? Impressionist paintings were often done in sort of outdoor spaces, and they were really informed by the context under which they were created. So what I mean by that is sort of that where you would take months, years on these realistic, highly accurate portraits, right, or paintings. Impressionist pieces were often focused more on capturing the mood, the atmosphere, the sort of feel of a moment, right? And they were often done on smaller canvases, painted in fields, outdoors, taken on trips. And as a result, they had to be created in a much shorter amount of time and under more strict work conditions, right? Maybe you only have access to a few different kinds of paints or a few different kinds of brushes. And so as a result, the Impressionist painters effectively learned to take shortcuts, but to build a style out of those shortcuts. And that's the key difference, right? So when you're looking at the reflections in the painting on the left by Monet, this is not how reflections work. These are squiggly lines and some ovals, right? But they evoke reflection, right? And so sort of the key thing that I want to point out here is that the revolution of Impressionism was a sort of shift in focus from asking, what is it, the subject, to how does it appear? And so from this, I think we can learn to think about style as a rule set. So hold on to that. I'm going to come back to that. But first, I'm going to tangent to this. So this is my first model, and I'm actually curious. Do any of y'all in the chat recognize this? Is this still an exercise that UTD does? This was like modeling 101 when I was there, but that was 5 years ago. So I'm just sort of curious. But yeah, so this was my first model, and it was interesting to me. Like, it was rewarding to go through the process, to learn how to paint textures and to do some lighting and stuff, right? But I was really sort of disappointed with the outcome. Specifically, I was disappointed because I didn't have full control over the outcome. And I think a lot of 3D artists going into the industry experience this. I wanted to make games that looked like Wind Waker, right? And my first thought as a student, brand new, was that learning to model and texture would sort of get me there. But then, upon actually doing that, I realized how much of a gap there still was between, painting a texture, right, and having influence over the rendering of a game, And so that ultimately led me to technical art. Answering that question, how do we create stylized rendering, has sort of been the pursuit of my career for the most part, up until now, really. So here are some works that I've done, some more recent explorations of mine, where you can see that I'm trying to really get into the nitty-gritty and really tackle the sort of stylized rendering problem from a lot of different angles. On the left side, there's a piece of work that I did for a game jam out here in Seattle, which evokes, I think, a lot of the sort of Van Gogh, impressionist style, the sort of swirly shadows and gradients and things, pastels and blues. And on the right side, I've got just an exploration of using like halftones and other other physical media as a sort of reference point and inspiration for trying to convey a certain amount of style on 3D assets. I also want to shout out really quick that I made this piece in. This is a small point, but I made this piece in 2018, which was, I believe, before Spider-Verse was announced. So just putting that out there. But anyway, moving on. But more than just physical media and imitating it, media like print and magazines and stuff, right? I was also sort of interested in making work that felt contemporary. And this is sort of, again, returning to the Impressionism revolution for a moment. The focus of those pieces it oftentimes sort of shifted away from religious paintings or sort of big monumental focuses towards small things. Again, the feeling of a sunset, or the atmosphere of a summer hillside with like wind blowing through the field of grass or whatever, right? But the point being that the subject matter was often more contemporary to the time period. So I'm showing my age a little bit here, but the left image here was a game jam that I did a number of years ago. But this is Phil Fish, who made Fez. And then on the right, I've got a sort of a take on the horror genre, spun into a game developer meetup group event. This is a small poster that I made for, I think it was Dallas Society of Play a couple of years back. And then going further still, on the left is a more recent project that I just did, which was sort of a music video, actually, of sorts, where we timed up the effects with music by an artist named Karen Connolly to help her sort of celebrate and launch the release of her album, her first album, called Almost, which y'all should absolutely check out, by the way. But it was a real pleasure sort of getting to work with her music. I've been a fan of it for years, right? And so this was sort of another attempt to sort of bring more contemporary subject matter into the work that I was creating. And then on the right is a more recent piece that I've made. Again, sort of focusing more on the feel of a moment, the atmosphere, the ambience, and not so much focusing on realism or getting things right. I'm sort of trying to bend and break perspective, mess with framing and stuff in this piece. So yeah, so let's talk about sort of portrayals of the future here. So the current portrayals of the future that we have in the big modern games that are kind of decades old franchises at this point, I think they feel somewhat antiquated. And I don't think I'm saying anything new with this, but I wanted to sort of use it to help frame the discussion a little bit. Also, just as a speaker's note here, it's a miracle that these productions get made at all. So I'm absolutely not dragging these by any means. I'm just trying to point out that, yeah, I think sort of oftentimes contemporary work that features contemporary subject matter has a way of feeling more modern than the, again, decades old presentations of the future that sort of we've grown up with these sort of huge franchise games. So on the left here is the emoji slime from a game called Going Under, which was made by the Aggro Crabs team. Yeah, so that game is full of really, really contemporary jokes and subject matter and all kinds of stuff. And Nick, the sort of lead developer on that one, is a friend of mine out here in Seattle. And on the right is My Neighbor. I'm not going to even try to pronounce that, but this is a piece made by Saint Vulture, which also is, again, sort of a hugely different stylistic perspective, but is, again, a take on more contemporary subject matter than what you might find in the Halo games or whatever. This looks almost like a sort of cookie cutter apartment complex. Yeah. So, okay. So that's sort of a big, broad overview of stylization and stylization versus like contemporary stuff or contemporary subject matter. Excuse me. And the sort of point that I want to drive home with that is, I guess that indies at this point, because they have to be developed under tighter time constraints and in shorter amounts of time, and because there are more people doing them in more locations, the teams can be more distributed. The point is that indies, much like the the Impressionist painters from the 1800s, are having to learn how to be more expressive within more constrained time windows, to be more expressive with more limited tool sets. And I think that's really the takeaway. So yeah, so let's sort of reapproach stylized rendering now that we've sort of covered some of that framing. So let's get into some technicals really quick. So this was a piece of concept art made by an artist named Qingye, who goes by C-Botany on Twitter. And you can hit their art station and stuff here. But effectively, I reached out to them for a piece of work that I wanted to make, just to ask them if I could use their artwork as a reference to try to recreate it in 3D. And specifically, try to recreate it as accurately, as true to the rendering of the concept art as possible, which I think is a sort of challenge that a lot of artists want to take on, right? So that pursuit is going to be the focus of pretty much this point of the talk moving forward, right? And let me see. So there are a couple points that I want to make here before we dive into this. But primarily, as a technical artist, tackling this problem sort of has two main focuses. The first is just how do we create that kind of stylized rendering in 3D, right? You'll see artists try to make ZBrush sculpts and stuff that sort of match the form language and stuff. But much like that original piece that I showed y'all, that very first model that I made, oftentimes those works will miss the sort of the lighting and the shading that matches the concept art. So they'll be the same, but not really, Or other times you'll see artists really go into the details of trying to match the exact look of the reference, but at the cost of practicality, right? So they're problem solving, but as a result, maybe that piece only works well from one particular angle, and it breaks down as you sort of rotate the object. Or they haven't incorporated the real-time lighting model. So if you wanted to use it in a game, you would be very limited on what sort of moods and atmosphere and how much you could sort of reuse those assets, because all the lighting is sort of baked into the surfaces, right? So as a technical artist who is interested in rendering, solving both of these problems is the job, right? And it's what I love to do. I think this is a really interesting space to creatively make stuff and to make really interesting and new things, right? But yeah, ultimately the pursuit is to figure out how to create this stylization accurately in 3D, but also in a way, but also essentially to present a practical pipeline for an actual game to use, one that is robust, that doesn't break down as soon as you introduce a point light, or that works from all angles, or that can be applied to multiple different pieces of geometry, even if they weren't ever things originally represented in the concept art. And so that's sort of the pursuit that I want to talk about here. So there
Actually,
are
Steve, if I can interrupt you really quick, I'm
okay.
kind of curious. Is there anything about that specific reference that kind of stuck out to you for you to want to like tackle this?
Yeah, it's dope. Basically. Yeah, so there are some things, and I'm actually going to get to that a little bit later when we hit the sort of technical breakdown, deep dive, live demo, whatever.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll make a point of calling out the specific stuff that I was looking at when I chose this piece, because yeah, that is also a factor, right? I chose this style specifically because I thought it was a problem, quote unquote, a problem that I could solve for. That didn't present too many things that were out of the possibility space.
Okay, absolutely, sure.
So sort of reframing this sort of problem statement, right? How do we do this stylized rendering, and how do we do it practically, right? There's a reason that Spider-Verse is such an uncommon thing, right? And also why it's so compelling. And that reason, I think, is largely because the tools that we have for production bias towards realism. Realism is the problem that our industry has been trying to solve for, well, historically, pretty much from day one, So the job of a technical artist who's interested in stylized rendering is sort of really bridging the gap between assets as it relates to textures, models, sculpting, low poly assets, lighting and rendering, materials in your game engines, the asset production pipeline. How are we creating our textures? What tools are we using? And sort of figuring out ways to use those tools, which were meant to do one thing, figuring out ways to use those to achieve an entirely different end result that maybe wasn't intended, So yeah, we're sort of bridging the gap all the way from the sort of most basic 3D model all the way into working game production pipeline, sort of from all of the factors. And really, you need to be able to touch sort of all of those factors to really deep dive and really get into the heart of rendering and stylized rendering and solving that problem, right? So, okay, so I want to talk about some of the resources that I've put together here before I actually break out into the live demo. But just to sort of start things off, what I have is a high poly sculpt on the far left. I've got a low poly version, which was just a quick Dynamesh that I made in ZBrush. And then, I baked out a couple different textures for the use, both to demonstrate what a regular asset pipeline will look like, as well as how we can use these same textures to achieve different stylized results. So I've got a color map, basically an outline thing that I baked in Substance Painter, and a normal map, and I've got a noise texture, which is just a render cloud that repeats in Photoshop. And then I've got some vertical lines, and you'll see how I use those later on. Let's see. So yeah, so traditionally speaking, if you were to take all of these assets that we put together, this thing that I sculpted in ZBrush or whatever, and tried my best to match the detail of the concept art, if you take all of that, put it through a normal asset production pipeline, spit out low poly with normals and everything, and throw that into your game engine, you're going to end up with something that looks like the thing on the left, right? Which might, match the silhouette, but does not match the rendering very clearly, So it's neat, it's cool, but it's not right. And I think this is where a lot of people or a lot of artists will stop. And this is the point that I'm sort of most interested. This is the starting point for me, right? And hopefully I can sort of talk about why this is an interesting problem to solve. So this is sort of just a demo of what I was able to achieve with stylized rendering, using all of the same assets, the same textures, the same model, all of it, totally the same, and also using the same production pipeline, but with a few basically rendering changes and considerations put in place to create something that I think much more closely matches the style and the intent of the original concept. All right, so as we dive into this, I want to sort of ask y'all to keep some things in mind. So again, I want to return to that initial sort of point that I made, which is think about style as a rule set. And just, try to think about these three questions. So how can we analyze style and figure out the implicit rules that it describes? How can we reproduce those rules in 3D? This is the problem-solving part of it. And then how can we make that solution practical for real-time productions? All right, let's dive into the demo. So give me a second to switch gears here. Oh, no, that was wrong. Cool, demo time. All right, so I've got the concept here on the left. Are y'all able to see this? Is this visible still?
Yeah, we can see it. You're good.
Cool. All right. So yeah, so just to sort of demonstrate this again, just to be really clear. So on the left is the model with normal maps and the standard Unity lighting model. So this is just the default standard Unity shader with an albedo and a normal map, and that's about it, right? And on the right is, again, the exact same geometry with the exact same normal map, the exact same albedo, but using a stylized shader that I put together. And I think the differences sort of speak for themselves. So let's dive into this. So again, at this point, feel free to ask me questions as we sort of go through this. This is going to go maybe a little fast. Again, it's not a tutorial. It's mostly just sort of meant to show the possibility space and sort of, open up the subject and make it more approachable. It's supposed to make y'all ask questions, basically. So let me just full screen this really quick. Okay, cool. So I'm going to put game view here. Yeah, so we can start to look at that and break it down here. Cool. All right. So first thing, I guess let's talk about tools for a second. So I'm using Amplify Shader Editor right now. You can use Shader Graph for this. You can use Amplify. You can write your own code. It is totally up to you. They're all totally fine and viable products. Use what works best for you. For the sake of the demo, I'm going to use a node-based editor because I think it's probably what most of y'all are using, and it's probably a little bit more approachable and faster, frankly. So let's dive into this. So first things first, I'm going to briefly show y'all sort of the component parts. So that did not work. Hold on. Forgot I gotta plug it in first. Okay. It's here. Boom. Yeah, sweet. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in on this for a second so y'all can see what's happening. So the very first little bit of math that I have here is to Well, actually, let me start here instead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call out an element on the reference, and then we're going to talk about how we recreate that element in the game. So the first thing that I'm going to look at when talking about reproducing the style is looking at the sort of vertical lines here that I'm seeing in the shadows. There's this sort of hashing that the artist uses that sort of appears when there is shadow or shading on the surface, when it's a back face maybe, or when the object is occluded somewhat. The other thing to note too is that it doesn't really, like, they're not super duper detailed. These lines don't really adhere to the surface of the I guess the geometry, you could say. They're just sort of general gestural lines to sort of evoke shading in these spaces. And so the way I'm doing that is with a texture, which is just this thing right here. So I'm getting the screen space coordinates, so the coordinates of the actual screen, and projecting it in 3D space onto the model. This is what you might do instead of using the UVs of a model to wrap the texture around the surface of the geometry. And so you can see that as I sort of rotate the screen, the texture, the lines are always vertical, no matter what angle you're sort of looking at it from. They always stay, you know, vertical up and down, even if I take the model itself and rotate it, the lines are still vertical, right? All right, so that's sort of the first part. And again, that's just trying to examine this one little element, just this one shading component, and trying to capture that. All right, cool. So the next resource that we have is outlines. And I think probably color textures also. Put this in and compile it. That is not very useful. Let me plug this one in instead. Cool. Do we have any questions or anything at the moment, by the way?
Not quite yet.
Yeah,
I think you're good to keep on going.
Cool. All right. So this is so I call this the outline texture. And it is basically what it sounds like. So there are sort of two forms of line work on the reference. There's the outline itself that hugs the edges and the silhouette, and there are the sort of surface lines of the geometry itself. So one of the things that I did, if you actually look at the sculpt here, one of the things that I wanted to capture is that this is not a polished sculpt. This is not like good. This is not production ready, right? You can see all of the working lines in ZBrush. You can see all of the sort of sketchy, scratchy noise and just working marks of the thing itself, right? So this would not be a production-ready asset by any means. Normally, you'd want to polish this stuff away, right? And so when you think about games that have done outlines and things before, the pipeline is generally going to be the artist makes the high poly version of the model, then they make the low poly version of the model, probably transfer some details like normal maps and textures, and they probably go in and hand paint those lines. And that's a lot of work, a lot of extra work to get to sort of outlined characters, right? So what I was hoping to do here is basically, instead of that, and I'm going to switch back to the slides here also. Instead of that, I wanted to figure out a way to try to transfer the details from the sculpt to the line work directly. So this is using Substance Painter to create something called a curvature map, and then basically modifying the curvature map to sort of push it into this line work. But effectively, the result is that the line work is transferred directly from the artist's sculpt. So they don't have to make the sculpt, make the low poly, and then make line work, right? They can make the sculpt, bake the textures, and their sculpt, the line work is inherited from that, right? So the style of line work is directly inherited from the style of the sculpt. So we're getting closer to the sort of artist's intent, and we're trying to do something that's a little bit more practical, right? We're saying, instead of taking 2 steps in this pipeline, we're going to keep you with just the sculpting step instead. So this is a practical solution that we're trying to think of, right? But as you can see here, when I point to the lines and the sort of accents the raised points in the sculpt here, you can see those lines are all transferred out to the baked texture. Yeah, and that's this this texture here. So yeah, so we're basically trying to let the artists work less because they don't have to polish up their high poly. They can leave it rough and actually turn that into a strength because those rough working marks become the sketchy line work and the inlines on the model itself. Much in the same way that when you think about how an artist like this one would sort of sketch out these shapes, right? You're inheriting the very kind of rough and in the moment intent of that line work, right? So we're trying to sort of stay true to that.
So is doing something like that
Mhm.
very possible with like shader graph or amplify or anything, or do you kind of need to bake that out from something like Substance?
Let me think here. So so I did it in Substance because Substance sort of made it a little easy. It's built on this something called a curvature map. Let me actually just see if I can find this for y'all really quick. Pull this up really quickly. Yeah, so a curvature map is basically this. So you'll have white lines for concave, and you'll have, or excuse me, for convex, and black lines for concave, right? And Substance will sort of let you push and pull values to sort of have wider or less wide lines. And yeah, effectively, you can sort of take this map that it'll spit out, and traditionally this is used for like edge wear and sort of knocking back, like if you have like a gun or something like this, right? You'll sort of use this texture as a mask to interpret between the paint of the gun and like the metal underneath it on those edges where it's sort of been roughed up, right? So that's the traditional use of this texture. So instead of using it for that, with some sort of basic processing that can be done in Photoshop or Substance or whatever, I'm taking that same texture that's baked out, basically inverting it, and then using the levels to push those values around until you get basically just sort of black lines on a white base. But you can sort of see how these lines line up with the sort of concave working lines on the model here. So it's a pretty direct transfer. This bit here is sort of the concavity of this one here, right up here. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend, well, I don't want to say I wouldn't recommend doing it in real time. Really, I would say just go for it, right? But the important takeaway is that this is built on a resource texture. The good news is that that resource texture is something that's generated for pretty much any sort of modern AAA regular asset pipeline. If you throw a model into Substance Painter, for example, you will get this texture by default, along with a normal map and an albedo and specular, metallic, whatever.
Okay, so that's really cool. So essentially, if you change the model at all, you would need to go fetch a new version of that texture.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. But again, that's also true for kind of any production pipeline.
Yeah.
If you update the sculpt, you need to sort of bake that stuff out. Yeah.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. So let me also compile this. So yeah. So I baked in actually two elements into this one texture. So I've got values. So let's see here. Okay, so you know that this is actually starting with a gray base. The outlines are black, and then the emissive parts, like the eyes and little gem on the forehead, are white. So I basically baked in two elements into this one texture, and I'm splitting those up. So here you can see the emission mask, and here you can see, when I compile this, you can see just the outlines. And so I'm just doing some simple remapping to sort of throw out the stuff that I don't need and sort of pull out two different masks from one texture. All right, so that's another building block that we have. And you'll note that I'm talking about these sort of in sort of basic building blocks, right? So we have a building block that is the sort of vertical lines for the shadows. Now we have another component, which is the surface internal lines of the mesh to get some of that sketchy behavior. We have another building block, which is just the sort of glowy parts, right? Okay, so what's another one? Let's see. Surface shadow. Wireless. Alrighty, so this one is just the shadow information. And you'll note something that I'm working in just black and white right now. Again, we're taking this really, really piecemeal. So you'll see on the sort of sketch here, you can sort of imagine if the light is sort of hitting this thing roughly from the top, that the shaded areas sort of on the abs here or under the arms, on the side of the arm here, inside this little cavity here, under some of these curved bits, whatever, right? This is sort of following, loosely what you would expect from, surface shadows on the object. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking the basic, let's see. So this starts out as just the normal like surface shadows like you would see on, oops, come on. Okay, yeah, like you would see on pretty much like any sort of standard material, right? So that's going to be basically just taking the light vector and the surface normal, so the normals of the geometry, and doing a dot product between those two. Yeah, let me know if we need to cover a dot product. But it's basically taking those and comparing those vectors, which spits out this just sort of standard surface lighting type, and then doing a little bit of math on that. So by adding a little bit to it and then rounding the values, we can sort of cut it off right in that middle section. So anything above 1 anything above 0.5 gets thrown up to 1, and then anything below 0.5 gets pushed all the way down to 0, to black, which sort of gets you this sort of mask. And just to sort of demonstrate this, this does follow the lighting. So if I rotate the light, you can see that it sort of behaves appropriately, right? So again, this is sort of talking about how do we make this a robust solution, right? I could just go in and paint in where I want the shadows to be, but what if I want what if I want a nighttime scene and then a daytime scene, or what if I want to have like a crazy time of day system where the light sort of changes over time, right? I would want the model to be able to work in any of those contexts, and in contexts that I can't imagine or haven't really thought about, right? And so I'm trying to create something that is not only stylistically accurate, but is also robust by integrating it with the existing systems of the game engine itself, in this case, the existing lighting models. So another thing that I want to point out here is that there are sort of two ways to approach this. There is the geometry normals, which here, I'm actually going to pop this open in Blender really quickly. So let's see. Yeah, so when I say geometry normals, this is what I'm referring to. So when you look at the actual like geo here, right? And again, this is a rough model. This is not like good topology or anything. Oh, I heard a little dropout. Am I still on?
No, you're good. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Yeah, so when I say vertex normals, this is what I'm referring to. So this is the really sort of low poly, just rough, like general surface information that's derived from all of the vertices. It is not what you spit out of a normal map, which is intended to capture all of the high resolution details of the sculpt. But just to sort of demonstrate this, if instead I were to run the normal map normals into this same calculation, the exact same calculation that I would get would return this result instead, which is, again, much more specific and much more accurate to the original sculpt, right? So this was that information that we baked out from the high res, and now we're sort of rendering that on the surface. But I'm not doing this for a reason. And the reason is that when I look at the shadows here, right, like this is a really smooth line. When I look at the shading inside the eyes here, this is not, conforming super accurately to the surface, like in the mouth. It's just sort of like generally just sort of sketched in, right? It's just kind of loose. It's really gestural, So I'm working my way towards a more gestural look by using just the geometry normals for this lighting calculation instead of the really highly accurate baked out normals. And so you can see now my shadows, instead of being really detailed and pixel perfect, now my shadows here are more gestural and just sort of fit the general curvature of the surface, So again, sort of using the same tools, the same resources to do something a little more stylized, right? Okay, so that's a building block that we have. So the next one is the outline on the object. So we talked about, the shadow outline. Excuse me. So again, returning to the reference here for a minute. One other thing that I noticed is that in some areas, it sort of feels like where there is shadow, the artist also sort of draws this. Let me know if y'all can see this this little draw over that I'm doing, but draws this sort of line. Can y'all see the yellow line that I'm painting?
Yeah, we can see the yellow line.
All right, cool. Yeah. So the artist will sort of draw a line on the top of these shadows, and again, it's very gestural. It's very loose, but it's a component of the style, right? So how do we create that? So using basically that sort of same approach that we made earlier, where we take the light vector and the normal of the geometry, right, to create this effect. We can use some different math to try to get that sort of shadow line earlier. So I guess I probably need to explain it at this point. So if anyone's not familiar, let's talk about a dot product for a second. So let's say this is the sun up here, yay, and you've got a basically a sphere, right? Let's do it like this. Cool. Just gonna shade this in really quickly. Bear with me here for just a minute, y'all. That's not gonna work. All right, so the blue lines here are going to be the geometry normals for this sphere, and the yellow line is going to be the light vector. So a dot product function basically compares two vectors. So in this case, we're giving the dot product the light vector and the normals of the model, and then it's evaluating those two vectors at sort of every pixel, right? So when the two vectors line up, so let's give these normals some directions really quick. So backwards, and this one is sort of to the side, right? So whenever okay, almost. All right, cool. So whenever you're comparing these two vectors together, if the vectors go in the same direction, this will return a value of 1, so bright white. If the vectors go in opposite directions, it'll return a value of -1. So basically black, but you can sort of imagine darker than black, right? So if 0 is black, -1 is like deep black or whatever, right? But effectively, that's the darker side. And then if you have the vectors going perpendicular to each other, that'll return a value of 0. So over the surface of this, we're going from -1 on the darkest side to 0 at perpendicular to +1 when the light is hitting just exactly that surface, right? So going back to the model here, let's think about this for a second. So going back to the model, one way that we can process this data is to let's see here. explain this. Whoa. Very cool. So, okay, so if we start here, this is sort of basically what we're getting from that dot product function. So one of the things that we can do is sort of process that data and push these values. This is what you would see whenever you look at sort of glossy shading on models. So we can really push up this this value and make the lighting look really, really glossy on the surface, right? But the other thing we can do is we can sort of push these values further and further and further to sort of get a really, really hard line between the lightest part and the darkest part. But again, remember, the values that we were working with were 1 all the way to -1. Even though we're only seeing bright white and solid black here, technically, the solid black is going negative. So if we're looking at how do we create a line that follows just the surface, like just the top edge of the shadow, one way to do that is to take the negatives and flip them positive. So if we apply an absolute value function, our light goes, instead of going from, here we go, instead of going from 1 up here to -1, with 0 being here, our light is going to go from 1 to 0 and then back up to 1, right? 1, 0, 1, because we're getting the absolute value. So when I plug the absolute value into this equation and recompile it, now you can see that we're getting just that line on the top. And again, pushing these values back to what they, I guess what they would normally look like by default. You can see that, yeah, so we're going 1 all the way to perpendicular where we hit 0. And then on this side, it would technically be going to -1. But again, absolute value means that we're bouncing back up to 1. Again, so we're getting this sort of hard edge right at that shadow boundary. And so from there, then we can start basically tweaking these values and pushing them towards just getting that really, really crisp, thin, tiny little line is just right on that edge, you know? And so again, going back to the reference, we're sort of trying to chase this sort of gestural line that's on top of the shadows. So I'm going to undo some of this here and sort of step back. All right.
So how does this look if you move around the light source a little bit?
Yeah, good question. So directional light, let's grab that, sort of rotate it. So it's a little hard to see. So let me do this. If I add these two together, this may not return exactly what we're looking for, but like, maybe it will. Just to sort of demonstrate this a little bit. Yeah, okay, so let's look at it like this instead. So this is the light shadow calculation that we're doing, and you can see that this is following the light as I move it. And so if I plug in that that sort of shadow line that we created, you can see that it follows, well, oh, whoops. There's a value. Okay, cool. You can see that it follows exactly just that upper edge of those shadows, and it also follows the lighting. And so we'll composite this later, and you'll start to see how this sort of all builds together. But for now, the sort of key point here, the takeaway is we're looking at a small individual component of the style of the model, and we're figuring out how to just recreate that small component. And then we're building layer by layer on top of it, right? Excuse me. Okay. So then the last bit I want to touch on is going to be the actual outlines of the model itself. So there are two components here. I'm going to focus on just the one for now, which is actually going to be the lower one. Oh, you know what? Actually, I'm processing these later. Maybe that's over. Okay, so that's actually going to be down here. Excuse me. All right, cool. Yeah. So these are going to be just the outlines of the model itself. So using that same exact approach where we take the model's normal and we take another vector and we use a dot product to get a sort of smooth result. We're doing the same thing here, but instead of using the light vector, which might come from the side of the model or whatever, we're instead taking the camera vector, which points directly forward from whatever angle you're viewing it at. So what that means is if I sort of push these values back to default, this is going to be a standard Fresnel. And in this case, I'm taking into account the normal map. But if I use just the geometry, we would, that's not it. If I use just the geometry, you would see the geometry normals, excuse me. We should see just a sort of, well, something happened. Let me just unplug the normal map instead. All right, cool, yeah. So if I use just the geometry normals, you can see that this is just a sort of smooth basic for now. And similarly to how we did that sort of hard cutoff in the shadows, I can push these values towards gloss and then add to them to get this really crispy, harsh fall off right at the edges to create that outline look. Yeah, so slowly, again, we're building all the components. So, and that's just to try to match some of the outline here. Okay, so let's actually talk about compositing some of this stuff, because that's where the magic really comes in. So first things first, let's just do this. So here's the albedo texture that I painted on the vertices in Photoshop, or excuse me, that I painted on the vertices in ZBrush. So really rough, really quick, just laying down just the flat base colors, just trying to match what the artist originally had here. But something that I'm noticing is that the artist sort of darkens the colors at the top of the model and then brings in this sort of gradient at the bottom here, right? And it's not tied to any of the surface information. It's just sort of loosely projected onto the surface, right? So how can we do that? This is not the most efficient approach necessarily, but I think it's a pretty neat little approach. So just for example here, did y'all know that you can use UVs for more than just texturing? Let me unpack that a little bit. Okay, yeah, here we go. Sorry, I haven't touched this layout in maybe a year or so. Okay, so here are just the normal rough UVs that I just auto unwrapped for this model, just for the line works and stuff, right? But you actually have access to multiple, they're called UV channels. So you can bake different UV coordinates or different UV like unwraps for each of those channels. So the thing that I did is basically just took the whole geometry, didn't unwrap it or anything, just projected it from the screen, just flat orthographic, just directly into the UV space, right? And so that's in my second UV channel. And this is really cool because then you can basically take your texture coordinates, the UVs, that normally are used to inform how the texture wraps around the surface of the model. And instead, we can use them to create a gradient on the surface of the model. So let me step back even further here. So at its basic core, this is what we're getting from that. So it's dark at the bottom and light at the top, which just matches the standard UVs here. So if you look at the red channel, for example, dark at the bottom, light at the top. If you look at the, excuse me, that was green. If you look at the red channel, dark on the left side, light on the right side. So by projecting the UVs just linearly flat into this UV space, we can take advantage of this gradient. And that also means that we don't have to like spend time doing like edge loops and cutting this up into nice like UV unwraps and stuff. And just sort of throw the screen at it and just quickly move forward, right? So, okay, from there, so using a lerp, because again, going back to the reference art, it's sort of a darker blue here and sort of a red here. So I need to have individual control over these colors. So using a lerp, I can use that original gradient that we made and do some math with it, pull in some colors, and now I can assign this top value a color. I can assign the bottom a color here. And I can also do things like control where that cutoff is, as well as how sharp that transition is going to be. And I can do that for both the top and the bottom colors, right? So then, just like you would in Photoshop, where you have one layer that's the base colors, and then a new layer on top of it that's kind of overlaid over it, we can composite these two together. So we have our color gradients, and we have our base colors. And when we composite those together, you get this, which is that original base texture albedo that we spat out, plus the color gradients that we put on top. And so now we're getting closer. That was not smart. Let me put this back. So now we're getting closer to the goal that we have here, which is darker on top, red gradient on bottom, and the sort of like base colors kind of throughout. You can see darker, red, and base colors, right? Cool. Okay, so let's go back and grab those outlines that we made, because that's going to make a huge difference, right? So surface line work. So let me take this one here and do a multiply. So in Photoshop, there's a blending mode called multiply. And it turns out that it is literally multiplying. All of the blending modes are just math. They're small little math operations. But multiply does exactly what it says. It literally takes the number values of the colors on one layer and multiplies them against the numeric values of the colors on the other layer. So because we're working in black and white, where black is 0 and white is 1, when you think about multiplying, anything times 1 is itself. Anything times 0 is 0. So if we take a black and white mask, in this case the inlines that we made earlier, and we multiply those like you would in Photoshop with layers, multiply those with the color, you get what you would expect. You get the black outlines multiplied on top of the base colors. So just like you would composite in Photoshop, we're compositing in our shader to return the stylized result, right? So we're using that one component from the style that we figured out how to match, and we're building that into the surface shading model slowly over time, layer by layer of detail, trying to match the original concept until we arrive at something that, you know, really, really hits it, you know? So this is cool, but it's definitely not like, it's not done, you know? We're not there yet. So let's pull in another component. We have not only surface lines, but we also made some outlines, right? So if we take the outlines and multiply those down onto what we had already created, now you get the original surface lines that we had from the texture. You have the base colors from the whole thing, and we have that outline that we generated from the Fresnel, which gets us some of that nice, you know, edge shading. Again, matching some of this, right? So you can really start to see how on this top surface, oops. Well, where's the head? Oh. You can really see how we're starting to really match some of that style much more accurately than sort of the sort of default shading model, right? Really starting to get there. Cool. Okay. So let's also pull in those shadows that we made earlier. So I'm going to skip over this for now. So let me just talk about the shadows for a second here. So previously, y'all saw that we had vertical lines. That was just this, right? So obviously there aren't vertical lines all over the surface of this mesh, right? So what we need to do is sort of figure out how can we get the vertical lines to only appear in the areas where there are shadows, and let just the surface show without vertical lines anywhere that light is hitting it, right? Because that's sort of what's happening here, right? So we already made a mask for the yeah, we already made a mask for just the lit side and the shaded side, right? So we can use, just like you would in Photoshop in compositing, we can use the shadow mask here to mask out the parts of the vertical lines that we don't want to see and return only the vertical lines in the areas that we do want to see, or where in the areas that there are shadows. So here you can see surface areas that are lit are staying bright white, and then where there were shadows, now I'm only revealing those surface lines. And again, this this plays nicely with you know, the directional lighting of the scene. All right, cool. So one more component on this, which was that sort of that line on top. So I'm going to multiply that in as well, just to complete sort of the shadow line work that we had assembled earlier. So not entirely accurate. There's definitely some bits where it's too thick, and it's maybe more intrusive than I like. But you know, it's close enough. It has that component, so it still brings on some of that character. And collectively, we've assembled a really sort of interesting way of rendering surface lines. And I know I keep harping on it, but again, this is sort of part of the problem, right? This works with Unity's lighting model, so we don't have to bake this for every single asset individually. We can apply this to any object that uses the shader, and we'll get expected results, right? So if we multiply that down on the base colors, just like we did with the previous lines, we get this. And now I think we're really starting to see it. You know, it's really starting to come together. Let's see, directional lights. Yeah, I think we're really starting to sort of see the style of the original artist starting to come through in our lighting model. So not totally accurate, but a lot closer than what you would get at default, right? Okay, let's keep going. So previously I talked about bringing in the emission inside one of these. Oh, come on. Yeah, so I baked in both the emission and the lines into the same texture. So let's add the emission for the eyes. So just like we did with the sort of surface colors, I'm just going to composite down an emission color onto the base that we have here using that emission mask, which should return. Hey, yeah, we got glowy eyes. Cool. And that feels really dope, you know? That's really sort of, that really hits it, right? I really feel like I'm sort of starting to see the sort of style that we're chasing come together now, you know? Cool. So last thing, and this is actually, I think, kind of interesting. So I'm looking at this horn right here. So normally with emissive things that glow, right, they sort of override the line work. They sit on top of it, you know? And so you would sort of expect that, you know, when things sort of bloom out, forgive me, there's a siren going off in the background. Bear with me 1 second here. Just make sure that I'm actually rendering out bloom. Okay, yeah. Okay, so, but I'm not. Why am I not? Okay, we're not gonna problem solve it. Normally, bloom will sort of sit on top of the surface, right? And so we would expect that when these areas bloom out, it would draw over the lines of the surface. But in the case of the horn, in the reference, that doesn't happen. So we need to figure out how to match that as well. So earlier, I just sort of stuck the emission on top of the base colors and just ran it outside, right? But I want to use a different technique slightly to get the emission to effectively live underneath the outlines on the horn here, right? Okay, so let me make it a little easier for y'all to see. Yeah, so you can see in this case, the line work sits on top of the glow instead of being overwritten by the glow, right? So for this, I'm using the vertex colors of the mesh itself to just create a little gradient here from black to white. And I'm using that gradient on the horn to drive another color lerp. And the only difference is that, kind of like you would composite again in Photoshop, right? The only difference is that instead of doing the lerp as the last step in the process, we're doing that lerp first, where we're bringing in the emission, and then we're multiplying the outlines down on top of it. So you have the bloom, and then 1 times whatever color blue is going to return that blue, right? But 0, which is the line work, times whatever is going to be 0. So this means that the darker line work will always be visible on top of the bloom, no matter how bright it gets. And so again, we're sort of achieving that little bit of stylization, just that little rule, by compositing it in this way. So let's try to, I guess, sort of summarize this a little bit. So hopefully the sort of takeaway that y'all are getting from me sort of expanding this pattern. Am I still live, by the way? We're still good? I haven't heard from anybody in a little bit. Just want to make sure.
Yeah, you're still good.
Cool. All right. So hopefully the takeaway from this is that what I'm doing is I'm effectively taking a look at the style of the render of the original concept, picking out a specific piece, figuring out what the rules are for that element of the style. These lines are always vertical. The lines don't follow the surface, right? So those are the rules that govern the style. And then recreating those with our shader, right? Same for the sort of lined gestural bit on top of the surface, And yeah, the sort of broad takeaway here is that while I'm applying these specific approaches to create generally this look here, you can imagine applying that same approach, that same conceptual approach to sort of any style, right? The Van Gogh pieces that we saw earlier, the ones from Monet, those also have sort of intrinsic rules that define the style. And so as a technical artist interested in rendering, the core of what I do is figuring out the rule set that the style follows, and then reproducing that rule set in a game engine, right? And I think that that's really fascinating, just a really sort of awesome space to sort of make and to make stuff inside, right? And of course, the coolest part of all of this is that just like, I'm actually gonna return to the slides here for a second. So, let's see, here we go. So yeah, so let's actually do a little bit of an exercise here. So let's take a look at some of these impressionist pieces, right? And let's talk about some of the implicit rules that the style is sort of defining, just as an exercise, So one thing that sticks out to me really, really plainly is that the reflections on the water are sort of made by these sort of horizontal dashes. I don't really see any vertical brush strokes here. So one rule might be that any water surface, any of the colors, any of the reflections that we do on the water surface need to be made up of only horizontal brush strokes, right? Similarly for the sky, right? There's this sort of like muddled pattern that sort of fluctuates between like 2 colors, right? So maybe that's a rule that we can start to follow, and you can sort of, again, you can sort of see how by leaning in and breaking down the style, you can see how it applies to, you can see how it does effectively describes a rule set. And the key here is that whenever you think about an artist and their own unique individual style, excuse me, whenever you think about an artist and their style, you sort of have to it sort of becomes obvious, right? That one artist's style is not the same as another, right? Like that's why you have like artists whose style you prefer and that are more recognizable, right? That's why a Monet looks like a Monet and not a Van Gogh, you know? So what's rad about this, about sort of noticing this, is that effectively the style of a given artist is just sort of, you can think about it as effectively just the rules that they follow whenever they create. And so if you can sort of codify those rules, in theory, you can sort of create anything in their style. This is the sort of basis for style transfer. And it's sort of the foundation, at least from my perspective, of stylized rendering. Applying that to a game engine, what that means is that you sort of have the ability, the capacity to figure out a set of rules for your rendering and then apply those across the entire game, which gives you dramatic and very powerful, but also very granular control over really the stylization of the whole product. And that is a much more robust and sort of more powerful way, I think, to approach stylized rendering than sort of the sort of flat lit or, you know, entirely, you know, painted, you know, baked in lighting approaches that you'll see from a lot of other artists whenever they approach, you know, trying to do, you know, flat lit characters or sort of other stylizations. Not to say that like anybody is right or wrong, but just to say that, yeah, you really have a lot of sort of stylistic control whenever you approach sort of the lighting model from this sort of rule set perspective. And that's really what I'm trying to drive home. Okay, so, oh yeah, final point, right? So to sort of demonstrate this, right? Even though I haven't created, you know, any sort of skull or anything here, right? I've got a little scene I want to open up. Hold on just one second. Yeah, here we go. Cool. Okay, so check this out. So, one sec, let it start to play. All right, cool. So check this out. So this, well, come on. There we go. So this skull doesn't exist in the concept art. There are skulls in the concept art, but they're kind of small and they're sort of hidden, right? But I think if you were to take this and just sort of look at it as like a still image, right? And sort of just ask a user, like, was this made by the same artist who made this piece over here? I think you'd probably say, yeah, like it's pretty convincingly like of the same sort of style, right? And that's sort of the takeaway that I'm getting at. There are skulls in this image, but this skull, this composition, this is almost like a poster, right? This composition does not exist here, but in following the rules defined, the shading rules, the stylistic rules that were defined by the artist in this piece, now I can make an entirely different piece using an entirely different subject and framing and lighting that still looks like it was made in the style of that artist. That's the power, that's the takeaway. So you can imagine if this was a rabbit model, for example, it would still look like it was sketched by this artist, right? Or if this was an airplane model, it would still look like it was sketched by this artist. So by understanding this stuff and being able to manipulate this stuff, you sort of literally have the ability to define the style for the whole game. And I think that is just, you know, infinitely fascinating and powerful when it comes to production, you know? And again, just really driving it home, right? These are sort of point lights, you know, that are actual just like regular point lights from Unity. And it behaves with, you know, the lighting model that we set up as I would expect, given the stylistic rules, which means that we can apply all different kinds of lighting and different kinds of contexts and moods and atmospheres and whatever to the object. We don't have to do anything too specific. Artists can use it in various contexts whenever they're doing different levels, different parts of the game, and they can use assets in sort of unexpected ways because we've not only matched the style, but we've matched it in a robust manner that lets us, yeah, sort of use the assets in multiple contexts because they hold up and they don't break down whenever you rotate the camera, you know? Okay, so we're hitting sort of the end of the talk here. And basically what I have for y'all at this point is really just some links and learning resources. And I don't think we're going to need to go through all of these or really any of them. They're here for y'all to reference. I think they're useful if this stuff interests you and you want to get started. Yeah, can we transition to the Q&A? How was that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them in the Twitch chat, and we can kind of go from there. So yeah, I think this was like a really, really cool talk. I think you've been able to articulate and kind of put into words a lot of the things that I personally find really interesting about, shaders and everything. So yeah, I really appreciate the breakdown. That was like really, really cool.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
I guess we can go ahead and wait for a couple. Oh, actually, no. Here we go. Out of curiosity, did you make that shader using a scriptable render pipeline, or is it Unity's standard render pipeline?
So I made this probably 5 years ago. Maybe not 5, maybe 3. So at the time, it was just using Unity's sort of standard forward pipeline. But there's not a reason that you couldn't do this in URP, whether that's going to be in the scriptable render pipeline, whether that's the sort of universal or the HDRP or something else, right? And actually, this is sort of the reason that Unity is moving towards the scriptable render pipeline in the first place, right? It's to allow artists and users to have greater control over the render pipeline, which is what we've been talking about, so that you can sort of lay down these stylistic rules across your whole game. So this was not, but you certainly can, and you could recreate this probably better using some of the different tools that it gives you access to.
Okay, cool. We've got someone who's interested in whatever the program was that you used to draw on your screen.
Oh yeah, totally. I actually have that linked down here also. It's called Lightshot. It's great. Yeah, just go get it. Actually, I have a bit of a rant on this as well. So one of the things that I found really useful as a just artist making content in the industry, especially as it comes to building portfolios and just sort of needing art to share on Twitter and all of that sort of stuff, right? Is to sort of do something that I'll call self-documentation, right? Basically, it's just a sort of good habit to get into. But as I'm sort of working on stuff, what's rad is when I use Lightshot, drag out the selection, and then just sort of hit save, it will go to a folder that I've specified, and it will auto increment the number, and I can just hit save and just be done. And now I've captured that image, and it's in a folder, somewhere, right? And then later on, whenever I need to put something on Twitter or whatever, right? I can. Oh, a second. I can jump to that folder and sort of immediately find, just all of the stuff that I've been working on, all of these little work in progress pieces, right? So in the same way that like Control S is just something you do, as you're working on stuff, right? That, quick grab a screenshot, hit save, hit enter, and then keep working is massively useful because, yeah, you're getting all of those images that make up the sort of breakdowns that you'll see on people's portfolios or websites, those sort of art dumps that you'll see after a long production finishes, all of that stuff, right? And it saves you a lot of time on the back end because you don't have to like go back to the project and open it again and figure out like where the thing was and whatever, right? You've already got it. It's part of the process. So I would really recommend grabbing some screenshot software of some kind and really sort of just making that a habit that you form. It's really, really useful.
All right, absolutely. Is that a free software?
Oh yeah, totally.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure everything that I've listed here is free, except for Amplify. But I'll point out, actually, the software that I learned shader editing on was called Shader Forge, which is made by Freya Holmer. And she has actually open sourced that and has updated it to work on Unity 2019. So if you want to use Shader Forge, you totally can. It's free. You can modify it, whatever. But as far as node-based shader editors go right now, I do actually still recommend Amplify over Shader Graph. It supports URP as well. And I find that the sort of tooling and the sort of eye towards user friendliness is a little bit nicer, at least at the moment.
Okay, sure. We've got one person curious just how long that whole project took you to make.
Ooh, that's sort of an interesting question. I would say that to get it to where it was, I don't know, sort of learning things along the way and sort of, yeah, making mistakes and improving things and, you know, trial and error, that sort of stuff. I would say, I don't know, maybe 2-3 weeks ultimately over a span of a couple of a month or two, I guess. The other thing that I would say, though, is that it was a bit of an experiment, and I actually never finished it because I sort of consider it a failed experiment in a way. I was trying to see if I could make a pipeline that would let me sort of do this line art automatically. And while I found a good way to do that, the unfortunate downside is that the sort of texture resolution required to sort of capture in high fidelity all of those individual lines for the whole object really sort of started to skyrocket. And I've thought of a few different ways to address that from here moving forward, maybe different approaches that I could take. But suffice to say, the reason that I stopped working on this one was because, you know, it was an experiment to see if I could make this style work. And this is, I think, sort of going back to why I chose this image initially. It was an experiment to see if I could make this style work. And while I figured out, I think most of the sort of the edge cases to get mostly there, yeah, the sort of line work issue was one that I wasn't really 100% able to overcome. So I sort of figured it a sort of lesson learned, and I'll try to think of a different approach. And once I can think of a different approach that might solve it, maybe I'll revisit this.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm kind of, you know, just personally interested.
Mhm.
How does some of the same stuff line up in your professional work? You know, what happens for you in a studio? Are you kind of just handed some concept art that you try to match, or you know, what's your pipeline like?
Hmm. Well, so that, I mean, that sort of depends on the product, right? Depending on what game you're working on, and whether it's like your own game or a game that you're sort of inheriting, right, or being brought on board to work on. You're sort of going to inherit some of that stuff. I think. Let me think. Yeah, so it really does sort of vary based on the project. I'll give you one example, actually. So let me pull up this video. So this is Inner Space, which is the game that I made with Polynight Games. And so I did the sort of style and rendering pipeline for this. And so with this one, the way that that sort of manifest was we needed to do a whole lot of asset work, and we were a really small indie team. So one of the sort of rules that we imposed on ourselves was that we weren't going to do any texture work, which meant that we didn't have to worry about UV unwrapping our models. We didn't have to worry about like painting textures or anything like that. We could just sort of throw on materials to just assign materials to faces, and then, you know, plug in colors and things for those materials, and just sort of go, you know. So that was sort of a rule that both informed the style and the look of the game, as well as was a sort of, you know, deliberate choice made by the texture artist as a way to improve the production pipeline sort of overall to speed things up, right? And that's sort of what I'm getting at. If you're a rendering tech artist, those are some of the advantages and sort of some of the sort of learnings that you can bring to the table whenever you're approaching a new project, or even sort of optimizing an existing one. I'm trying to think of another example that I can maybe give y'all. Unfortunately, I have a little bit of a hard time talking about work stuff just because so much of it is NDA. But yeah, hopefully that sort of answers your question. If there's more there, please feel free to sort of expand on it. I'm happy to go further.
No, I think that definitely helps for sure. Um, we have a specific question in chat. Ellie's asking, have you found any satisfying methods for working with reflection in non-photoreal styles? It seems like something that's not really done a whole lot.
That's interesting. So I haven't messed with it personally, not very much, but I can think of a few things that might be worth trying. So we're going to exclude ray tracing from this conversation. So thinking about the sort of methods that are used for reflections in games right now, there are sort of two main ones, maybe three. Not really two. There's the sort of cube map approach where you capture a cube map, so basically like a 360 camera texture of just the environment from wherever you're at. And then that is then basically projected and lined up in shader to create those reflections, right? So there's that approach. And then the cube map texture is sort of updated every frame or every other frame, right? The other approach is the screen space approach, where you'll sort of have reflective surfaces, and you'll grab a screen. You'll basically copy the render of the screen, flip it, and then overlay it on just those reflective areas and sort of fade the boundaries a little bit. Which is why sometimes you'll sort of look at an object reflected in the water, and then as you look further down and the object goes off screen, it also disappears in the reflection on the water because it's not actually being drawn as part of the surface, right? So, okay, so basically what we're looking at for the sort of core of these reflection technologies is really just some textures, right? So screen space texture sample is a texture, right? It's a render texture. Cube map is a texture. It's aligned to a sphere, right? So it's projected spherically, but it ultimately breaks down into a 6-sided box, of flat textures. So if I were going to try to stylize some of those, what I would look at doing is between the capture, the render part, so whenever we create the texture, right, between that step and the step where we're overlaying that texture back onto the scene over the reflective bits, I would try to write a shader that modifies that texture, right? So you could do something that uses a noise texture to sort of distort the position of the pixels in your render texture before it's flipped. And that might return a sort of like painterly style, right? Or you could do stuff like, I don't know, this is sort of weird, but maybe interesting. You could sort of take the color values in that texture and multiply them up, or maybe just like be really selective and let's say only red objects, right? So you're going to just isolate the red color channel and scale the brightness on that up, right? And then apply that as a texture, as like, inverted or whatever, right? And the result of that might be that, objects that are red in your scene are reflected like really bright, like they throw out, like they hit the bloom and everything, right? But they're reflected really brightly, but only in reflections. And that's sort of really interesting, Or you could even do things like grabbing a cube map of stuff that you're only rendering to the cube map and not to the main view. So, for example, when you walk up to the surface of the water and you sort of see your reflection in it, right? You could do something where when you capture the cube map reflection, instead of capturing the player character that's seen in the main render, you could swap that out with like a monstrous version or something, right? And then capture the cube map of that, which would only be visible in the reflection. So you could get this effect where you look into the reflection and you see like, your monstrous version of yourself sort of instead of the base character. Yeah. So there's like a lot of things that you could do. And I think it's also a really interesting place to experiment. I haven't seen a lot of developers do much there. So I would be super interested in seeing that area explored more for sure.
I guess somebody's gonna kind of lead the way on that at some point.
Do it. That could be you. That could be whoever asked the question.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask really quick, what is your relationship with using like generated noise textures versus using custom ones that you might have made or have used from some asset pack somewhere?
Let's see. Actually, that's a question that I'm still trying to solve. So I'm lazy, so I tend to just sort of like grab a render texture from Photoshop or something like that, More recently, I've been looking into some, open source like noise generators for things like Perlin noise, or to grab like Verneuil. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but like a Verneuil noise as well. That does not roll off the tongue very well.
Yeah, it's a stupid name.
So the reason that I do that is mostly just because I'm lazy and I don't want to hop into Photoshop or some painting software and to paint my own. But I've seen some very, very awesome work done with sort of hand painted or custom noise textures. It's also not practical for every development pipeline because licensing costs are pretty expensive. But if you're at a large studio that already has access to this software, or your studio has sort of already bitten the bullet and sort of assumed the price of like a substance designer, for example, you can generate very interesting and very cool, noise textures using the sort of texture generation pipeline from Substance Painter, or excuse me, Substance Designer, and get some really interesting results by doing that. So that might be another approach.
Okay, so I know like Unity shader graph has noise generators just as nodes
Mm-hmm.
in there. I mean, do you find yourself, would you use those, or just throw in a noise texture that you just downloaded somewhere?
So I tend to, well, it depends, right? It depends on what you want. The thing to keep in mind is that there's a performance cost to calculating it in real time, right? So on something like Pokemon Go, like we would never do, like a noise generation sort of thing in real time, just because on mobile that would be way too expensive and it would drain your battery life and all kinds of stuff, right? So in that case, we would use a baked out texture, right? And that is really the point, those noise texture generators, right? They're doing all of that math, and the reason they're putting it into a texture is to sort of save you that performance on the game side, right? So they're packaging information into this pre-computed format, the texture, and then you're just pulling all that detail in one pass instead, or in one sample, instead of having to calculate the noise with any sort of number variable samples. So if you want something that is really performant, I would lean towards probably just using textures. And if you need it to be dynamic, you can make one texture influence the UVs of another, or you can combine textures, black and whites, to create, sort of some dynamism within the shading. And so there are clever ways that you can sort of get around the, baked or pre-baked noise thing, right? But if you have the resources, like the GPU resources or whatever, and your game is going to be on a platform that, like, I don't know, has like a 2080 or something in it, and it doesn't matter, right? Then yeah, go ham, right? Like, use the noise generator. You inherit sort of dynamism just by virtue of it being rendered and really calculated every frame. So you can do some really cool stuff with those. It depends on your use case.
Okay, cool. No, that definitely that definitely answers my question there.
For sure.
Okay, great. We've got a couple more questions rolling in. One
Go for
person
it.
says, "I can program. I'm an artist, and I'm starting to dig into shaders.
Hell
What
yeah.
else should I be learning if I want to get into technical art?"
Um, hmm. Yeah. So sort of going back to the sort of the big question: what is a career in technical art? It depends on what you want to do. Do you want to work on stylized rendering? If so, do these things, right? If you want to work on tools, for example, maybe do these things. I guess the sort of short answer that I would give you is, if you can sort of identify the things that you are interested um, in like within the realm of tech art, it doesn't matter how achievable they are, or so how far fetched they are. Just the stuff you're interested in, like how did they do this, or how does this work, or the stuff you want to learn, right? If you can identify those, I would say just chase that curiosity. Honestly, that maybe sounds like a non-answer, but I guess what I'm getting at is that curiosity, no matter what your context is sort of a guiding path. And I think once you sort of have those big questions, right, you can be really opportunistic about the jobs that you take, the contracts that you take, the kinds of projects you choose to do in your free time. And ultimately, the point that I'm getting at is, yeah, sort of regardless of what your context is, if you are curious, if you're chasing, knowledge of some kind, right, you're going to sort of intrinsically choose the things that sort of get you step by step closer to gaining that knowledge, or sort of meeting that goal, right? So without knowing specifically, what your specific interests are, it's maybe a little hard to advise on this one. But yeah, I would say basically, if you can find that sort of North Star, or if you sort of have a list of interests, questions, whatever, just chase those. And by trying to answer those questions, you will build the knowledge that you need to do the job that is intrinsically interesting to you. I think this is also why tech artists are broadly a really sort of diverse and diversely skilled group of people, because none of us really land at tech art as much as we sort of arrive there from somewhere else. You know, I started as a 3D artist and worked my way into tech art because I had to make an indie game, which meant I had to wear a lot of hats and learn how to make our asset pipeline as, you know, performant as possible, so I didn't kill myself over trying to make all these assets and texture all these assets over 5 years, right? Yeah, hopefully that gives you a tool to use, even if it's not really an answer to your question.
Okay, cool. Another question in here. Someone is curious about the God, I can't talk. Impressionistic shader that you made for the game jam that you were talking about. Currently on the left side of the screen right now. So what sort of rules did you follow when making that?
Let's see. What rules did I follow for making this? So I think the biggest rules, let me just enlarge this a little bit so you can see it more clearly. So I think the biggest rules for this one are, I think what I was chasing was trying to create a sort of painterly shadow style, right? I don't know how well it's coming through because of the stream, but you might be able to see that the sort of paint strokes and things, the sort of pointillism, the dots that you're sort of seeing around these shadows, they're sort of updating every couple of frames, but they're not smoothly blending. They're sort of popping in place, and so it sort of evokes, you know, layers of brushstrokes being applied like every couple of frames. It gives it a sort of 2D animated quality in a way. So I guess the rule for that one was first, yeah, sort of, you know, low frame rate 2D animations and sort of trying to match that. So cutting down on the 60 FPS update rate of the render by sort of cutting that into a lower update rate. The second thing is, yeah, matching the pointillism, right? So pointillism is sort of a style where you take your pen or your paintbrush and sort of tap it a whole bunch to create spots, and over time you build up detail and gradients and information, or small little brushstrokes. So there is sort of a black and white texture, render texture, excuse me, which is the shadow render, right? So it sort of identifies these are the dark areas and these are the areas where shadow is not, right? And so sort of in the same vein of that reflection question, where before you multiply the shadow texture or the shadow render on top of your screen, you can first create the shadow texture, then modify it, and then overlay it. And that modification gives you access to stylizing the shadow, right? So in that case, I used a really soft shadow, which gave me some gradient, which gave me some gradient boundaries around these edges. So you can see like the fall off on this edge here is really sort of soft. Same here. There's a lot of sort of range between the darkest and the lightest tones on these edges here. And that little bit of sort of blurring, that little bit of gradient space allowed me to overlay some extra detail. So I took a sort of texture with a bunch of spots on it, right? And sort of overlaid that onto the shadow texture. So the spots aren't visible in the brightest areas, and they are, you know, already being multiplied down into the darkest areas, so they just blend into the darkest, right? But where it was a smooth gradient, now those spots sort of appear in this little boundary of the shadow, right? Then I did some UV warping to basically stretch those dots, and so you'll see in some of these areas, it almost looks like there are sort of longer brush strokes that curve and follow the surface, like there's some good curling and stuff happening here, right? And so by stretching out those dots and sort of distorting them, it creates the illusion of a paint stroke, right? Yeah, sorry, that was sort of in the weeds, but sorry, I kind of got lost there a little bit there. Hopefully that answers the original question, but let me know if it doesn't.
Yeah, you're good. I I think that's a pretty cool approach to take, to be honest. Okay, I've got one more question for you. I'm kind of interested. What are some, you know, current projects and current companies out there that are inspiring you?
That's interesting.
I hope that the pause means that there's a lot.
Sorry, the pause means that I'm thinking and I'm trying to consider it. I think that that's sort of a tough question, right? I mean, there are always artists and games that look incredible and look amazing and that are inspiring. But I think for me, a lot of my inspiration on this sort of stuff, as maybe as a parent, sort of with these images right here, is actually coming from areas that are not themselves games. So other media, right? So the Van Gogh painting, the style for the image on the left, right? That was really where the inspiration came from, right? And the one on the right, mentioned it earlier, right? But sort of halftone patterns, comic book, the sort of misaligned printing, and sort of creating that in real time, right? Is sort of where that one comes from, Yeah, so I would really say sort of all over. Again, it sort of goes back to that like interest question, Actually, one piece of really good advice that I got sort of going into game development early on was well, it was basically that in order to really get good at game development, you sort of need to love making games more than you love playing games. And I've always thought that was a really sort of interesting piece of advice. So I guess the takeaway for me, sort of as it relates to that, is I play games and I reference them, but like I also like do a ton of other stuff, right? I'm interested in a lot of other things, and as a result, I pull inspiration from a lot of the areas of interest in my life, and I try to bring that stuff back to games. The takeaway there is that it I think returns a sort of a fresher result, a better result, and is I think also intrinsically a little bit more more interesting because it's not something that already comes from the space. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that definitely kind of clears that up a little bit. um, have you heard about Mu Cartographer?
I
Somebody
have. I
brought that
love
up
that
in
game.
the
It
in
is
the
one of my
chat.
favorite games. It's so
Really?
fucking
Okay.
dope. Yeah. Hmm.
Because yeah, I thought that was a really cool example
Yeah.
that they brought up here.
Uh, I'm not going to pronounce the name correctly, but it's Tion or something like. Excuse me, something like that. Um, is a French artist. Yeah. That game is so fascinating. I just I love it so much. It hits like so many of the like yes I love this like Steve like brain buttons that I have. It's not super approachable, but it's so damn cool. I love it.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Um, cool. I don't currently see other questions rolling into the chat at the moment, so now might be a good time to just kind of slowly wrap things up.
Cool.
If anyone has something really last minute that you want to throw in the chat, feel free. But otherwise, yeah, I mean we're almost at 9 p.m. our time, so
Yeah, sure.
I thank you for coming out to talk and kind of giving
Totally.
that tech breakdown. I thought that was like super super neat. I really appreciate you like walking through all that and showing the whole compositing process and everything. So awesome, yeah. So with that, I guess we can kind of close out for the night. Thank you
Cool.
again for coming out, Steve. Um, and thank you everybody who's stuck around for a little while listening to this talk.
Can
We will see you.
I
Uh,
say
oh,
one thing real quick
yeah,
before we
yeah,
close it out?
absolutely.
Cool. All right. So I just wanted to mention it again. So there are links and resources if you want to learn how to do this in the slide deck. I have four different pages worth of links and resources. So please come open this thing up, check it out for yourself. If you're interested, try it out. Those are the places that I learned, and I think they're going to be really valuable to you. And yeah, I'm Steve. You can find me at @Zapper on Twitter or just on my website. And yeah, reach out if y'all have questions. Say hey. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. um, someone is asking where we can get the slides from. I believe you already shared those with me, so we can post those to our Discord server. Yeah.
Yeah, feel free.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. They'll be on the Discord. If they're not already, they will be shortly. So yeah. Thank you again for coming out. We really appreciate hearing from you. And with that, everybody have a good night. Thank you so much for watching the stream.
See y'all.